And good evening and good morning in Australia, where we have some listeners and viewers, and good afternoon in the Pacific time zone. Uh, First of all, let me get my notes up here. I'm Zev Yaroslavsky. Some of you may recognize me, and I barely have a voice, and I apologize for that. And I want to welcome you on behalf of members of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Janice is away for the next two programs, and it's my pleasure to sit in for her at these America at a Crossroads programs. Tonight we have a very special guest, Jason Tatenhove, former spokesperson for the Oathkeepers, an extremist right-wing group. After leaving the organization, Jason testified against the organization before a congressional hearing. He has written a book entitled The Perils of Extremism: How I Left the Oathkeepers and Why We Should Be Concerned About a Future Civil War. It's a gripping story with an important message and an important point of view that will be of great interest to this audience. Jason, thank you for being with us tonight. And thanks as well to the incomparable Larry Mantle of LAist for moderating tonight's conversation. Next Wednesday, November 20th, a week from tonight, at 5 p.m. Pacific time, we hope you will join us to welcome once again former United States Ambassador to Russia and my good friend, Mike McFaul. Mike will be joined in conversation with global democracy scholar Larry Diamond. Both Michael and Larry teach at Stanford's Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. The topic will be The Election is Over. What do the results mean for Ukraine, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy? This is a critically important subject, and we have two of the most knowledgeable speakers joining us to address that topic. And I have a sneaking feeling that the topic will be as relevant a week from tonight as it is tonight. Now to introduce tonight's guest and to lead our discussion, please welcome Larry Mantle. Larry is host of Southern California's longest-running daily radio talk show, Air Talk, on National Public Radio's Southern California affiliate, LAist. Larry is winner of too many awards to list and a cherished moderator of America at a Crossroads for the past almost 5 years. Larry, it's all yours.
Zev, thank you so much. As always, it's a pleasure to be back with you tonight for another important America at a Crossroads. And my best wishes as well to Janice and Mel this evening. It's always a pleasure. Tonight's conversation on extremism, I think a very important one as we look at the future of our country, of course, and a topic that's been dealt with in some of the programs over the course of these 5 years of America at a Crossroads. Jason Van Tatenhove is an author, essay writer, and frequent media guest on the risks of violence from far-right groups like the Oathkeepers. Jason's time with the group started with a trip to southern Nevada to cover the standoff with federal officials by supporters of cattle rancher Cliven Bundy. Now, Jason embedded with the Oathkeepers as a participatory journalist attracted by the group's anti-governmental ideology, but soon he'd become an adherent of the group and its national media director. We'll find out what led to his disillusionment and now years-long advocacy against extremism. That work includes testifying about the motivating principles of the Oathkeepers before the Congressional Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Jason, welcome to America at a Crossroads.
Thanks, Larry. I appreciate you all inviting me on.
So you were a punk rock loving, tattoo shop owning young man before your involvement with Oathkeepers. You come from a family of artists and counterculture embracing people. At what point were you in your life prior to heading off to Bundy Ranch, and what made that seem like the thing to do?
Sure. I looking back now, I can certainly say that I was in a vulnerable position. I didn't see it at the time, but hindsight is 2020, and having been exposed to some of the people that I have, and the people like Mary McCord and others that really have helped me understand kind of the other side of things. But I had just moved to Montana. I had a successful tattoo shop in northern Colorado. My wife, who we were married for 30 years, was doing a little better with her health. She had been chronically ill the entire 30 years we were together, but she was doing a little better. And I really hadn't had much experience other than growing up outside of New York City when I was a kid in northern Jersey. Then moving to kind of the country's suburban trophy wife of a city, Fort Collins, Colorado, where I was continued to be raised by my stepfather, who really became my father, who was a computer programmer, one of the R&D guys for Hewlett Packard, which exposed me to that circle of intellectualism. And also Colorado State University was right there, and there was a lot of independent documentaries that would come through, and I have always been a documentary junkie. I've always been drawn to that, and I had moved. I was planning on opening another tattoo shop in Montana, with the money that I had made with the selling of the one that I had in Fort Collins, Colorado. But the economy just wasn't the same. The culture just wasn't the same, and it just wasn't a realistic option. So I was podcasting and writing, and I was working for a small little internet radio outlet, went by Revolution Radio, and I was reading entirely too much Hunter S. Thompson. I had been going back through his omnibus, and had just finished up the Hells Angels, which was really his first foray into participatory journalism, and it had a pretty profound impact on me. And I saw what was happening at Bundy Ranch on the news, and I thought, well, this could be my chance to maybe write a book in the same vein, to give a try to this, because there's something in my gut that just told me that this might be something historic that's happening. And I'm kind of wired that if something's going on, I kind of want to go there and get boots on the ground and see who the players are and what the dynamics are, and what the story is there from where it's happening. So I made some calls over that weekend, and I sold it to the owner of the radio outlet that they would pay for me to go down there. I made some calls with some connections I had back in Colorado politics. And by the end of the weekend, I was set to be embedded with Stuart Rhodes, the founder and president of the Oathkeepers, to go back down to Bundy Ranch and be embedded with him there during the standoff.
And just for those who might not recall when this was all taking place, it was over cattle grazing on federal land, something that the Bundy family had been doing for years. The federal government charging grazing fees, and it's a whole issue that brought people to the site, potentially to engage in armed conflict with the federal government. Or so it became kind of a flashpoint for this anti-governmental movement in the country. I do just want to remind our viewers that you can ask questions of Jason in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And a little bit later in the hour, we'll be passing on those questions so that Jason can answer them. Please include your first name and the location you're viewing this from. It's nice to be able to share with others where we have viewers. So again, that's the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to do that. So you describe in your book even the drive there, how kind of adrenaline pumping it was. You see the excitement is kind of palpable, actually. It's sort of crazy, but it's also, I get what the appeal of this is when you're rushing off to cover this story and to do it. And just elaborate that a bit on sort of what the appeal is for the participants who feel like the fate of this family and their livelihood is at stake, and they're gonna protect them by battling the government to do it.
Sure, and there's a common thread that kind of runs in the background here, and I can relate it to my own life at the moment. Things weren't going as I had planned. I was kind of spinning my wheels. My wife was her health was starting not to do quite so good. Again, the tattoo shop wasn't working out. I wasn't sure what to do with myself. I was working during the day with the Department of Livestock for the state of Montana. But that was just a very minimal part-time job. So I really didn't have much going on. And, to go off and anytime something's happening like that, it is exciting, when you you're there. I had no idea who these people were. I showed up in a Ramones t-shirt. My nails were painted. I had a mohawk at the time. I didn't quite fit in, but I get there after selling it to my wife that I'm going to go on this crazy misadventure, um, in the hopes of maybe someday writing a book. But, I had no idea who these people were. I'd never met Stuart Rhodes before. I'd heard about him on Fox News and the Oathkeepers a little bit, and then more so on Infowars, which, is really kind of where I got my idea of it. And, they're going down to a ranch in Nevada to square off with guns with the federal government. That could have very well turned into something more than just a standoff. So, it was exciting. And, that is part of the allure. There's certainly a Chuck Palahniukian Fight Club-esque draw to some of these standoffs and the people that go to them. And then I'm sure the same was echoed in the January 6th events. When you have a charismatic leader who's telling you, this is important. And a lot of the messaging around Bundy Ranch was that there are sniper hills and there's sniper teams in the hills that this could turn into another Waco or Ruby Ridge. And that, it was up to just Americans standing up organically to go out to this desert to stop that from happening. Um, and there were many thousands of people that left their jobs and their families, and just gathered out in the desert of Nevada.
So, as misguided as this is, there's a real sense of mission. It sounds like camaraderie, a sense of purpose. You were at this point in your life where you're being challenged by economics and what's going on in your relationships. So this is sort of it's in a sense an escape and to something
Sure.
that's very dynamic. At what point did you go from being a participatory journalist who is getting up close to get the story, but not personally involved, to someone who's really gripped by the ideology and becomes
Sure.
a part of it?
Yeah, I covered it. I did live broadcasts from on location, and accompanying articles that went along with that. And then there was kind of a lull for a while. Everyone went home after Bundy Ranch. Cliven had gotten a bit too much camera time, and when he started talking about some somewhat racist ideology, it kind of stopped that national news coverage, and that for a lot of these groups stopped the donation flows that were happening that allowed them to be there and have a presence there. And that flow of donations is an important aspect of it. That national attention is an important aspect of it. And I think it was, they learned a lot from that. I overheard conversations where $30,000 to $40,000 were raised in a week on donations. So, and it kind of changed the trajectory of the Oath Keepers. But to answer your question, I was asked to go to the next standoff, which was in Josephine County, Oregon, the Sugar Pine Mine standoff, which was over land rights issues and mining rights that had been grandfathered in. And then a third at the White Hope mine in Lincoln, Montana, which you probably will remember from where the Unabomber had been eventually arrested. Um, and each time I was getting more and more inside access. I was trusted more. I had built more of a rapport. And, I had this intention going in that I was going to write this book. And the second time around, they had asked me, because, a lot of times they'll have someone that they designate as a PIO or a public information officer. But, it's oftentimes someone who works at the Rent-A-Center or, is a car mechanic, someone who does not know the ins and outs of media. So I was asked, if I could help them format their press release at the second one. And I told them very specifically, I'll help you with the formula of it, the who, why, what, where, when, and how it flows. But I'm not gonna, my name can't be associated with it. The subject matter is all up to you. I'll just, show you an example of how it's done. And help them with that because I was getting this access. And the third time around, I said the same thing, same agreement, but apparently there was a miscommunication because my name was included at the bottom of the press release. So I got a call at 6:30 a.m. in the morning from my bureau chief with the Department of Livestock yelling at me about how my name was in every newspaper in the country and not in a good way. So, I went to go, let Stuart know what I thought about this. And he, was like, wait a second, maybe this could turn into a good thing. I have need of someone with your skill sets, and obviously you're able to do it. So maybe we should talk about you coming on and working as our national media director, and you can help me with these things, and I can pay you to do it. And I'll be honest with you, after leaving the Oath Keepers over the last 3, 4 years, I'm back with traditional journalism. I work for a local newspaper as an accredited journalist. I've got a column. I've worked as a staff reporter in different beats. I never got paid nearly as much as I did when I was working for the Oath Keepers. To this day, I
Well,
don't get paid as much.
and it sounds like, Jason, it wasn't just the money, but I mean, you were at a place in your life too where getting this recognition, being courted for this position, was that part of it too?
Sure, and part of it was a sense of community. I was very isolated. I'd gone back. We decided to move to originally it was Butte, Montana, because my strange father, my real father, who I hadn't really spoken to in close to 18 years, lived in the next town over, and I was hoping to reconnect with him. And he was listening to a lot of very right-wing news sources, and just being in that area and that culture, that it's harder to find more central base. So it became almost an echo chamber. I was working on these stories. I was surrounded and consuming the media like that, and it really has an effect. Where you can take a punk rock guy who grew up outside New York City and then in Colorado, and you begin to see a change. And I didn't see it at first, but and it was only a small segment of my life. It was about a year and a half, between a year and a half and 2 years that I was involved with them. But it was enough that at a certain point I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself anymore. And instead of the
Yeah.
mohawk and the punk rock t-shirt, it was a crew cut and um real tree camo. I didn't look the same. I wasn't speaking the same. That my friends didn't look as they did back in Colorado. And I was
Is
lucky
it
that I was able to recognize that.
is as you're describing this, I wonder, is it akin, do you think, to joining a religious cult or any
It's
kind of an
very similar.
extremist group where you have a community and maybe you even leave behind what had been your values previously because the value of being part of that group psychologically is so great.
Yeah, and it's part of this formula that you can short circuit kind of your critical thinking skills and sense maybe your previous sense of who you are morally. I would never have seen myself as being the national media director, growing up on the Front Range of Colorado, later on in life. I just not would not have seen it. But I think that being in a place where things aren't working out so great, and being surrounded by a sense of community, and you have a charismatic leader. And Stuart was certainly telling me the things that I think he wanted me to hear. I remember him talking to me about, Jason, I'd love to go, protect a gay couple in their pot farm from, the federal government coming in. And I could always get behind being skeptical of the government, and then a bit anti-government. Obviously, my views have evolved over time, but coming from the family I did, my grandfather was a part of the abstract expressionist movement. My grandparents were immersed in the literary community of New York City in the 50s, 60s. Rubbing elbows with militants in my family was not that far of a stretch, but it tended to be of the left-hand variety.
Yeah.
And rebellion goes away from where your family
Yeah.
do. So, that's where
But
I
not how
rebel.
not how you expected yourself to be. I want to go back to Alex Jones and Infowars because you mentioned you were listening to it, and many of our viewers will know the legal travails of Alex Jones and lawsuits over things that he had said about. Well, I won't even go into it to repeat some of the things that he said because they're so hurtful. But just explain a bit about how InfoWars and its far right themes, its conspiracy theories, how this played not only into your thinking and sort of set the table, but for other members perhaps of the group.
Sure. I think, we largely are a nation of conspiracy theory junkies, again, I'll use the term. We love a good conspiracy theory. I mean, look at the listener numbers for Coast to Coast AM. And you'll see that it's just a huge number of people. And I think if you look at, social media consumption habits and then YouTube habits, that for some reason we have this love affair with conspiracy theory, that it kind of feels like something that others don't, and it helps make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense, or maybe the truth of it doesn't seem like it could happen. So some fantastical story about it, for some reason, is able to make an impression that sometimes the truth can't. And they are definitely very the heartbeat of extremist movement in the United States really is conspiracy theory, and I saw that with the Oathkeepers. I saw that with Infowars. But if you look back at the original, orders we will not follow, that all ties back to an old conspiracy going back to that time called the Jade Helm conspiracy, where it was revolving around the UN peacekeepers rounding up gun-owning Christians and re-educating them in big box empty Walmarts and such. But conspiracy theories are evolving all the time. There are always new ones coming out, and it crosses partisan lines. I mean, look at the conspiracy theories that are happening now with the election that's just happened, and Elon Musk stealing the election through hacking via Starlink. They just spring forth. So it gives new material that you can brand your message with, that's ever evolving, and you can spin it. And I think it plays a pretty critical part in where we are right now. We are a species that is hardwired for storytelling. We relate to the world through storytelling, whether it's religion or learning, or from the time we're a child, we're told about the world through stories. And I think, looking at where we are now, you have to go back over the past decade or so and look at the storytelling we've been consuming as a nation, because that's a big part of where we are now.
Well, one of my favorite examples, Jason, what you just described of sort of that conspiracy theorizing goes across partisan lines is back to the COVID-19 vaccine, because I knew people very anti-Trump said, I'm not going to take a vaccine that's developed when Trump's in president. Who know, with totally untrusting, even though it's of course developed with, world-class laboratories and scientists. And then of course, when Biden becomes president, then I'm going to get the vaccine right. And to me, it's just sort of an example of that sort of pattern seeking of how conspiracies develop. But in the case of Oath Keepers, one of the things that I think has been very concerning to people is the idea that these are law enforcement officers, that these are ex or even current military. So you spent this year and a half or so with members of Oath Keepers. Is that in fact true, or instead are these wannabes?
Um, it is true. It is true. And I think it's a growing segment of the membership. But, a lot of them were not combat veterans. They were veterans who, did administrative work. Stuart Rhodes himself was not a combat veteran. Combat veteran. And I think, he specifically targeted them because they are a segment of our population. Let's face it, veterans have not been well treated in America after, serving. And so again, you have kind of this disenfranchisement, having less hope than maybe you've had before, which opens you to being vulnerable to this type of messaging. But a lot of the combat veterans we would see back in the day, and keep in mind this is going on 8-9 years ago, that so my information's a bit dated in that. But a lot of the combat veterans that would come through, I would term them as fairly squared away with a low tolerance for BS. So a lot of times they would come in and see that a lot of the messaging didn't align with actions over time. And they would kind of come in and involve themselves, but then they would exit stage left pretty quickly too. Though a lot of them kind of began to set up kind of a cottage industry of training groups where, they would provide combat training to these different groups at a cost. And, they were teaching very real skill sets, and these were very real war fighters who had these skills. Um, I again, I think we need to look at what's kind of brought us to where we are now. A lot of them were disenfranchised and still are, and I think that's you know common today as it was previously. Law enforcement also, more and more we're seeing, the CSPOA, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, where they're doing more and more. They were talking about organizing and invalidating votes if Trump hadn't won like he had. But there was a point in time where they were doing post-certification trainings where, it allows them to have kind of this opportunity to indoctrinate a bit through, bonding in this training environment. There were times when, we would go to a different part of the country and, maybe we were going to go help with, say, the county clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky, that wasn't going to sign the certifications on gay marriage licenses. Well, turned out they didn't want any help at all from the Oath Keepers. So the first thing we did was go to our local sheriff's office and just sit down and start talking with these sheriff deputies in a very, poor community that did not have many economic resources. These are people who had to pay, if they had body armor, they had to pay for it themselves. They definitely felt the strain of being funded, and we'd go connect with them, and by the end of the night, we were helping them chase down criminals that had just committed a crime. So,
Wow.
there's obviously something happening there where, someone can walk into a sheriff's department and make a connection that quickly.
And become essentially vigilante alongside law enforcement. I wanted to ask you, Jason, about had the vice president won this election, do you think that there was significant potential for um, fighting involving militia groups, attacks, terrorist activity, in an effort to overturn the election?
I think certainly so. I think it had been being talked about. I think it was being planned out, and I think we dodged a bullet in one respect. I mean, the downside of that is, we may no longer have a functioning democracy at the end of all of this. But in my thinking, but I think that and I was invited out to a think tank tabletop exercise at the University of Pennsylvania, where we discuss these types of things, and I think it was a very real potential, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking that. And I think they were preparing for that, maybe more than they were preparing for, a possible loss. So if there's a silver lining, I guess it's that we've avoided that.
We've had militia groups, of course, for many years in this country, and you mentioned some of the standoffs historically, and we've had terrorist acts carried out by members of far-right groups in this country. Do you feel like we are closer to armed confrontation, a civil war in this country than we were earlier in the evolution of these militias and anti-government groups?
I think probably so. I think what's happening is an emboldening. I think that they've become more accepted and more mainstreamed it, and by the president himself messaging directly to them, and obviously using them during what happened during the January 6th events. I think I talk about this normalization process a lot, where, there was a time where, when I first showed up at Bundy Ranch, it was shocking to see someone in what would be termed, full battle rattle, which is when you have, the people in their fatigues and camouflage gear and helmets and body armor with an AR-15 and sidearms, and dressed as if they're ready for a battle, because some of these players are. I said it during my testimony. I think we've been exceptionally lucky that we've had as little violence as we've had, and we have seen violence, but I think the potential has been so much more over the years, and we've really gotten lucky. But unfortunately, with the rise we're seeing just immediately after the election in rhetoric and in threats and action, I feel we're in for a really bumpy ride.
And for those who just joined us, the testimony that Jason is talking about was before the Select Committee of Congress on the January 6th attacks, where he spoke for several minutes about the threat of extremism in the country. Thankfully, there was not an armed confrontation with the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. What kept that from happening with Stewart Rhodes, other members of the Oath Keepers? We saw the military-like formation as they were going up. What kept them from fully arming themselves to engage in a shootout with Capitol Police?
I think that to a certain extent it was leadership, and we got lucky that Stuart Rhodes, while being who he is, was still a Yale educated attorney. He knew if you go back through the history of these standoffs, he was often behind those police lines where he was good at projecting optics and spinning them that he was going to be on the front lines and there leading the charge. He was not often, when it came to boots on the ground and crossing lines that could get him in legal trouble. He was more encouraging people to do it. He was kind of the devil we knew, whereas unfortunately now that leadership has kind of, they've cut the head off the snake with legal action, and that may be undone here very quickly, and most likely will be undone very
You're talking
quickly.
about the 18-year sentence that he
Yeah,
received.
yeah. And
You
him
think
and
he'll
other
likely be
leaders.
pardoned?
But yeah, I think absolutely so. And sorry, that noise in the background is my humidifier. Apparently ran out of water and I just keep trying to pumping. But I think that really what we don't know where this is going to go now, because fortunately, we didn't have leadership that was going to lead the charge on January 6th. And I think I think we'd be living in a different reality if that had been the case, that, a Stuart Rhodes or one of the Proud Boys leadership were to have led that charge, or then Trump going and leading himself like he said he was gonna, we'd be living in a much different reality, because I think they kind of got timid a bit in all of that and didn't fully commit to what they had intended to do. But I think that's no longer the case. I think now that resolve will be there. And with a new generation of leadership coming up, these are younger people who have grown up in a more extreme environment and have been radicalized younger on, that are going to be much more willing to lead those charges. So, I think the days of that not having that full resolve and
Yeah.
committing like they could are over.
Wow. Can you speak a bit to the appeal of President-elect Trump to people like the Oath Keepers? Because, the core of the ideology, it sounds like, at least originally, when Rhodes founds the Oath Keepers, is this sort of anti-government. There's a kind of libertarian core to it. I mean, he was a Congressman Ron Paul staff member, as you mentioned, Yale-educated attorney. So it sort of starts that way. But Trump, even though Trump is highly critical of the federal government and talks about all the ways he's going to dismantle it, in fact, he advocates for using the federal government in a very activist kind of way. He just doesn't like the way it's being led currently. So how does that fit in with the ideology of the Oath Keepers, whose big thing is warning about federal government overreach and control of people's lives?
I think it's first off, I think a lot of the leaders that have come up, and we see, I mentioned it before, that what they say and what they do tend to diverge. That unfortunately their moral anchors are not that strongly tethered, and we saw that with the creep of the evolution of the Oath Keepers over time. I mean, I think you're correct in your portrayal. When I first kind of started looking at the Oath Keepers, historically, it seemed to me they were kind of an anarcho-libertarian book club. But once they, found um, the power of the optics of a standoff and the amount of money they could generate and the national, international interest in the media and kind of getting them in that middle of that spotlight that drew them to a further right place. We saw that again happen. The Oathkeepers are very specific with not associating with known racists and whatnot in the beginning. But with the rise of the alt-right and even the term the alt-right in our national lexicon, we saw that move further to the right as that's where the base of membership was. That's where the potential was. And these guys are opportunists at heart. I think that they see opportunity in Trump. And I think Trump's administration has been courting them since the second campaign, the first time he had an administration. I think that goes back to Roger Stone reaching out to leaders way back in the day. They're always looking for more ways to seem legitimate. And
So they felt validated by Trump
yes,
in a way that
yes, absolutely. Being mentioned and
they
being
hadn't
part of
before.
that story, and then direct or indirect contact that may have happened. It all validates and bolsters them. And I think that each side is going to see this as an opportunity. I'm sure there are things that Trump may see a paramilitary wing being useful for.
We've seen the rise of bro culture, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And in fact, President-elect Trump heavily courted bro culture with podcasts that he appeared on, and much of the rhetoric at his rallies was really aimed at that young male demographic. And I wonder, the for young people, the advantage of bro culture for alienated males who are angry at women and feel like they've been marginalized in society, the advantage of bro culture is they can connect online with like-minded people. They can, say things that they do about women or people that they believe have been elevated by the Democratic Party, and they've got that whole, social connection to do that. And I'm just wondering, is that going to take some of the juice out of militia type groups and other far right groups? Because that requires a real physical commitment. You have to go places. You have to arm yourself. If you're just in the kind of digital world of bro culture, and I'm not equating the two, but I'm just saying for the disaffected young male, it would seem the bro culture would have a lot of advantages over going to the extremes of a militia group.
Yeah, I think we're going to see an evolution. I don't know if the militia community is going to look as it has over the past 10 years. I think to a large extent, it's going to look more like what we've seen in Florida with the state security force. Militias are constitutionally illegal. I mean, this is something that Mary McCord over at Georgetown Law really is able to explain very well. But once you have a governor who is, authorizing a security force, it's no longer illegal. And we've seen this fracturing of the country already along cultural lines. Just today there was announcements that here in Colorado, Polis and I believe it's the governor over in Michigan that they're forming kind of an alliance or coalition for governors to fight back against the loss of democracy on a federal level. So I think that we're going to see an evolution and it's going to be kind of a hybrid. I think we're still going to see, much as we saw recently since January 6th, these things have kind of gone hyper local and you see a convergence of groups that may not have come together previously, whether it's to protest a trans or drag library reading hour or, a trans athlete. I think it's gonna be much more of a hybrid, which is very well connected, but still drawing upon the blueprint that
Yeah.
these older extremist groups have given.
Well, speaking about these, kind of showing up at the library or the athletic event, I think it'd be good for you to share what actually led you to leave the Oath Keepers, because as you mentioned, um, anti-racism was important to you, and it was a conversation that you overheard in a market that made you realize you were in the wrong place. Please briefly share that
Sure,
experience.
sure. And that was kind of the line in the sand, but it had been building up for a while. I remember kind of, um, as I mentioned before, kind of not recognizing myself in the mirror anymore. I'd gone to Malheur to, see what was going on there and write about it during that standoff. LaVoy Finman was someone that I had interviewed several times, both before and during my tenure with the Oathkeepers. LaVoy Finman is the guy who was shot and killed by the FBI and the state troopers up at the Malheur Refuge. And I had been riding around with him in his truck just days before, and telling him, "Look, this is not looking good. You have a family. You need to live and fight another day. This is, you can go and continue this." But he seemed like he wanted to be a martyr, and that's what happened. But I wound up going to his funeral in Kanab, Utah. And I have three daughters, two of which I'm still raising in my house now. Now on my own because my wife passed away last year. But you know, I saw his daughters breaking down at his funeral and just being emotionally shattered. And I, of course, saw my own daughters because, they looked similar as to how I would have imagined my daughters looking at that time, at that age. And I began thinking, what am
Yeah,
I
yeah.
doing? I'm not writing my book. I've certainly been sucked into this much more than I thought I would be. I don't recognize myself anymore. I had friends who were journalists saying, "Jason, what are you doing? Go back to writing, go do your thing. You're getting sucked into this too much." And then, you know, uh, I walked into and I again I come from a very leftist household. I come from a blended family where, my aunt and cousins who married into the family were Jewish. My cousin went to Hebrew school, so we'd have blended holidays where, we'd do our suburban white Christmas and we'd also bring a Jewish aspect for my cousin and aunt. And we had a very close-knit family. And I'm lucky to have had that upbringing because when I walked into the supermarket, it was the end of the day. We were living up along the Canadian border in a small little town called Eureka, Montana, right on the right near Idaho on the Canadian border. And one supermarket, very isolated, and people gathered at the local deli that's off the side of the supermarket
Yeah.
to talk about the day. And I remember walking in and seeing one of the core members that I had met on the first night of being at Bundy Ranch, first interaction, introduced to me as one of the core members. And they were there with some of their associates of theirs and talking out loud about how the Holocaust had never happened. And my jaw just dropped, and I called him out on it and was like, "What are you talking about?" Well, just and of course they backpedaled. Well, it was overblown. It's just the usual stuff you hear when people are trying to justify anti-Semitism. And I didn't even bother to get the groceries they had gone to go get, and I went home and called a family meeting with my wife and kids. And that Christmas, it was just after Christmas, not long after, was one of the first I didn't have to choose between buying presents for my daughters and medicine for my wife. Things financially were
Yeah.
going great, but we were living in housing that was largely subsidized by supporters. We would never have been able to support it otherwise. And I told them, "Look, I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't know how we're going to survive. We're going to have to reinvent everything, but I can't do this anymore. This is a failed endeavor." And put in my resignation that night.
All right. Let's
Yeah.
take some viewer questions for you, Jason. Sarah asks, what do people in Oath Keepers or Proud Boys or any of these organizations, what do they really want? What is their ideal society that they want to live in?
I mean, what it seems to me that it's always the ones yelling the most about freedom and draping themselves in a flag that have a very narrow view of freedom. And I got to talk to a lot of these people. I interviewed a lot of these people, some of the top sovereign citizens out there. And, it was a bit shocking for me to talk to them and say, well, wait a second, game this out for me. What does the world look like if we get our way? And a lot of times it's a Christian ethno state where people are removed from there if they do not believe the same way, if they do not look the same way. In the case of sovereign citizens, it's anarchy, and not like the good philosophical view of anarchy, but the ugliness of human nature and anarchy, in reality, that it's a destruction
So
of
it's
the
not
that
really
we
a
have now.
coherent, so it's not really a coherent, here's the ideal,
Each
um,
group is a little
because
different.
Christian nationalists they could describe what they want the country to look like, but it sounds like that's not necessarily, there's not a coherent vision here.
No, each group and each community is going to have that's going to be a different answer slightly. But there are some common threads. It's generally um, very white, very Christian, very straight, and not very much tolerance for human rights and other things outside of that. It's unfortunate. It's much like where we seem to be going right now if we don't begin to resist and say, this is not the world I want. This is not the America I want my daughters to inherit. And unfortunately, I don't know if we're too late already. But it's a loss of, the human rights that my grandparents and your grandparents fought for. America hasn't been perfect. It's been ugly, and it's been a grappling match. And it's been one step forward and three steps back, but it's still, we've made progress, and it's a loss of that progress.
We have Larry ask, is Trump, in your view, likely to pardon everyone convicted for the January 6th attacks? And what will the effect of that be on people looking to commit violence against the government?
I think it's very likely, and that's not just me saying. I just had a call with one of my attorneys out of DC who's an insider, and I think it's very likely that will happen. And I think we've seen this before with, take like Eric Parker out of the 3% when he did some jail time and came back. We've seen people who have done jail time and come back, and they really have a rock star's welcome. It elevates them in this culture and this community to kind of a rock star celebrity status. And Ammon Bundy ran for governor unsuccessfully not long ago. We've seen these
That's
people.
Cliven's son, right?
Yes, Cliven's son, and he's the one who organized and spearheaded the Malheur Wildlife Refuge takeover. So, unfortunately, it is going to embolden. It is going to be a justification, and really, to a lot of people, a sign from God that this is the direction to go. We've seen where these groups will key on to that, and there is a segment of true believers who do truly believe that may not fall within the doesn't have a very good moral anchor, but are true believers. And I think Ammon Bundy and some of those are
Yeah.
in that category.
Gordon asks, how did Oathkeepers get its name? You briefly referenced this earlier about the oath people are expected to
Right.
make, and how it relates to law enforcement and the military. But briefly elaborate, please.
Sure. Oath Keepers the name refers to the oath that military, law enforcement, and politicians swear to uphold the Constitution and defend it against enemies, foreign and domestic. Um, and again, it's a bit of irony because now it seems to be that loyalty largely is not based on the Constitution, at least in the far right of America right now. It seems to be shifting to loyalty to Trump and the Republican Party, which is now a family business. So that's what it refers to, and even the logo design, the optics of it, that's based on an Army Ranger tab. If you look at the logo and the patches that Army Rangers actually wear, it's a ripoff of that.
Uh, we also had a question from Sandy about How large is the Oath Keepers? And maybe that's not one number because maybe they're active members and then other people who have some degree of association. Also wondering, is there a central location for it or is it completely dispersed?
It's hard to say. I mean, even at the height of it, when the claims were 40,000 members, that was largely inflated because it was members, people who had bought a membership, which gave them access to a paywalled website. One thing that we were very good at was that propaganda spin. That if we had a standoff, we would be lucky to get maybe a dozen actual members showing up. But it looked much larger because, we they were engaged in social engineering, and learning as they go, and they've been doing it for a while now. So they're getting better at that spin. And I think it's a very nebulous thing. I mean, I don't, it's not necessarily the groups that um, are the concern necessarily. It's more like a game of Go, which is, how much territory, how many people do they influence with, the fewest resources so that they can, accomplish their goals. Um, and I think that that's growing. We're seeing more and more overlap between groups that would be specifically separated and not collaborating. But now, anytime there's an opportunity where they can elevate all of them at once, they're going to take that. So, you know,
This is a related question from EA in Santa Paula, California, wondering how organized the movement of anti-government white nationalist groups, militias, are they particularly organized, and do they feel more empowered having a president who has, in their view, reached out to them?
um, I think that I think I made the mistake previously when I left of just kind of, oh well, it's just those guys, and they're not all that squared away, and they've got their internal drama and fighting, and they're going to wind up eating themselves. But I made that mistake too, and we saw that the mechanism of democracy was almost dismantled on January 6th. And now we have a new administration that's empowered and has a plan and a playbook, and is largely empowered now. So, I think it would be foolish for us to discount them in any way. They're becoming more and more sophisticated as time goes on, and more empowered. So I think we need to take all of this just extremely seriously.
We have another viewer who asks, what role does anti-Semitism play in the anti-government movement and organizations like Oathkeepers? You mentioned, of course, the conversation in the supermarket, but what's your sense of how deep that goes?
I think it's growing deeper. At one point they were very specifically non-racist. So some of the organizations, some of the groups that showed up on Bundy Ranch were straight up Nazis, National Socialists, militias. But I think, unfortunately, anti-Semitism has become much more mainstream and accepted where it has been taboo for, a decent, more taboo anyway. It's never fully disappeared and obviously never will, but, it's now in an empowered cycle where we're seeing. I went to Denver to go to interview a rock band and go to a show this weekend. And Denver's a pretty decent bastion of leftist liberal community, and there was racist graffiti markering and painting on the sidewalks and streets that I noticed that were in neighborhoods I never would have thought of it. Enough that I mentioned it to my girlfriend that I was with, that that I've never seen this type of thing here before.
Yeah.
So I think it's growing like a fungus all over the country.
We have a question from Leslie in St. Louis wondering about how you combat conspiracy theories. You were talking earlier, and I was struck by this because I think it's so true that, you know, there's a huge market for conspiracy theories, podcasts devoted to, and all kinds of mainstream platforms offer those as well. And Infowars is traffics in all these kinds of conspiracy theories. So given that there's like a visceral, like a dopamine hit from listening to all this kind of content and a kind of excitement that it brings up in people, how do you combat that?
I think we don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, again, of course, I'm biased because I am a storyteller and I come to this as with the views of a storyteller. But you know, our storytelling has been hijacked and weaponized. And I don't think it's that, the far right has all these great literary geniuses that are doing these things. I think it's just they're churning out a massive amount of it, and it gets into these algorithms. And with the rise of social media, it's become a blast furnace. But I think it's up to us storytellers and us creatives. Right now is when we are needed most. For me, I see good storytelling that's been reclaimed, and I hate to use the word re-weaponized, but I think we're at a time in history where we can use words like re-weaponized and be okay with it, because we need to do it for the side of truth. Journalism is evaporating before our eyes. And that's from my local newsroom that I'm still a part of here in my small mountain town, the newspaper I work at, to you know CNN and those foundational newspapers. I mean, we really are in a historic time. And right now we need our artists and we need our writers, and we need to be putting out stories that tell the messages and build the mythologies that we want the world to be for our grandchildren to inherit. So
You're talking about the threat to journalism. We just lost a local newsroom radio station in Los Angeles a couple days ago. We are down to two stations in Los Angeles, the second largest media market in the country, that do news. I'm in one of those newsrooms. When I started in this business 40 years ago, virtually every broadcaster had a newsroom. And to see the how diminished it is. I mean, thank goodness there's a paper in your community that you can write for, and that there is a source for local news, because they're becoming fewer and farther between. We're just about out of time. Jason, just want to give you an opportunity for a very brief, like 45-second closing comment, maybe something to give us a sense of what we can do. What are some of the ways that you think we can respond to this threat that comes from this kind of far-right extremism?
sure. I think it's going to be small actions that we take in our own little spheres of life. No one's going to come save us. It's not going to be some sweeping politician that comes and saves the day. It's up to us. There's going to be moments that may be uncomfortable, but I was very disheartened and then thinking of hanging up the writing gig after the election. But the more I listened to my fellow writers, and the more I talked with fellow creatives and artists, the more that heartbeat grew stronger, that voice of the resistance, that now more than ever we need our writers and our creatives, we need our documentarians, we need our journalists that are writing for the side of right, of human rights and actual freedom for everyone, for the world we want to live in and our children to live in. We need to foster that right now. So if you're a writer, if you're creative, whatever your talent is, now's the time to really dig into that and find your voice. And then as opportunities come up in your day-to-day lives, maybe it's talking to crazy Uncle Bob at the Thanksgiving dinner table about where the country's going, that you just have refused to talk to him over the past couple years because things have become so divided. We've got to find a way to reunite as human beings in America, or we're all screwed. And more importantly, our kids are screwed. And this is something I've been writing fiction about and gaming out and writing about in my columns and my books. Now's the time. No one's coming. It's up to us. So find that creative spark in yourself, because the future depends on it.
Jason, thank you very much for spending this hour with us, talking about your experiences very openly and the journey that you took, and then talking about it at the meta level as well, and what kind of challenges it presents for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. And I also want to encourage you to please support these programs. I was just talking about how journalism is facing tremendous threats in local and even national journalism, but this is a chance for you to support these programs, nonpartisan in nature, put on by this nonprofit, Jews United for Democracy and Justice. You can make a tax-deductible contribution at jewsunitedfordemocracy.org. That's jewsunitedfordemocracy.org. And it can be a one-time contribution, doesn't have to be huge, but every little bit helps. But if you could do that to help these programs, we would very much appreciate it. Also, want to invite you to join us again 1 week from tonight, Wednesday evening, November 20th, 5 o'clock Pacific. The election is over. What do the results mean for Ukraine, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy? Ambassador Michael McFaul will be in conversation with Stanford's Larry Diamond, both of them associated with Stanford's Hoover Institution and the Spogli Institute as well. Please make sure you join us for that program again next Wednesday, the 20th, 5 p.m. Pacific. From all of us at America to Crossroads, have a very good evening.